Chris?
Yes, sir.
I'll assume John here. Would you guys, do you prefer to speak from the table here? Or would you want to go to the mic?
I can speak.
It's either way.
I think that'll save time.
Well, that's fine. The only thing is, of course, we didn't lavalier people up, so you're either at the podium or you're at the table. So it's one or the other.
I'm good. Yeah,
okay.
I'm good.
Oh, I mean,
we should all stay at the table.
Yeah, you just can't wander the room.
Well,
That's all.
the camera can stay trained on us.
Well, they'll change it when
And
they...
and as each of us talking, you can see the reaction from the other person, and if
Right.
somebody's jumping in,
Right.
it gets interactive. So
Yeah.
you're not trying to go
Yeah.
back and forth.
I just wanted to make the point that you couldn't talk like I'm
Yeah, I
talking
think
now.
that- I think
They won't
the
pick it up on the
lectern
webcast.
is not
Okay.
a university.
And we should, then we turn our mics off when we're not talking. There's no feedback then. Just makes it a little easier.
Right. Okay. So push the top, just like the idea.
Paul, you've got so many titles. I don't know which one you should put down. We've got you down here as a senior advisor. That works for you? Okay.
That was that time his latest signature.
Okay.
Yeah.
John, folks decided they kind of wanted to stay at the panel table when we talked as opposed to going to the podium. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. And then it's just push to talk and we're ready to go.
Stand here.
Okay. Well, more formally, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program this afternoon. My name is Bob Fiedler. I'm the Director of Defense Education at ROA. We do a lot of programs every year. We welcome all of you to come to them. Almost all of them are free. We have an aggressive program schedule in April with a program on imminent threats, probably on the 19th of April. This is a terrific program put on by ROA and several young scholars plus several old scholars from AEI. The Kagans, Fred at AEI and his wife Kim, who's president of the Institute for the Study of War, plus a number of young scholars there tutoring. And we did our first in the threat series about 3 weeks ago. It was one of the best programs I've ever heard. We have another series of programs coming up on the 23rd of April and also on May 3 on medical issues. So we just welcome you to those programs. Check our website for information on them. Today's program, if you want to look at it or refer others to it, can be found at www.youtube.com/ROA video. So if you've got colleagues who'd like to look at it after the fact, that's the site, youtube.com/ROA video. This is a unique program we've got today. I think it's going to be very exciting. We're going to have a lot of time for interaction with the audience. There have been a lot of programs in the last couple of weeks on the 10th anniversary of the beginning of the Iraq War, but this one is really unique, I think, that we've got some people who started the process with CENTCOM, Colonel Golia, with the J5 planner at the time, and went all the way through the ORHA process, the CPA, and continued on with a distinguished military career thereafter. Paul Hughes, Colonel Paul Hughes, was at NDU when everything started out, and then he went to ORHA and CPA, and of course now he's a senior official at the United States Institute of Peace, where he serves as senior advisor for international security and peace building, and is one of the omnipresent thinkers in this area. And of course, at the end of the table, we have a good colleague of mine, Chris Holshek, who is a colonel of civil affairs who had the 1st Civil Affairs Battalion that went to Kuwait in January of 2003, began his tactical level planning at that point. So we hear from the planners at another level, and people who are on the ground. So I think this is going to be a very exciting program. We're going to start today with Colonel John Agolia, and John is now the Vice President for Government Services at IDS International. John?
Good afternoon, everybody. Where I'd like to start is to discuss the initial planning that went into Iraq. Most people don't know really when that actually started. We were handed a memo from the Secretary of Defense on the day after Thanksgiving in November of 2001. And in that memo it said, we're not going to find a Karzai for Iraq like we did for Afghanistan. Therefore, we really need to start thinking about what would be the post-conflict governing structure and what would be some options look like for basically taking down Iraq. And again, as I said, that was the day after Thanksgiving in November of 2001. We then did some work to put together some conceptual discussion points for General Franks to discuss with the SecDef, and that grew into General Franks going to meet the president at his ranch in Crawford a few days after Christmas, like 26, 28 December or so. He gave an initial concept brief to the president. Now, in that piece, I raise this because the thing we talked about is post-governance in Iraq. And most people think no thought of planning was being done on that. It was the thing that started us, one of the concepts that we drew from the very beginning. And in it, we laid out three options. Option one was to have some sort of government in exile that could come on in, and whether the Iraqi people or Iraqi leaders who were exiles and people who were in, you could bring out and form a government in exile, kind of like the Free French or the Vichy, not the Free French or the French government with de Gaulle. Another option was, could we look at military governance? And the third was some sort of coalition provisional authority, some sort of civilian authority of which we as the military supported. And the reason we said it's key to identify which way you're going, because that's going to then identify who's going to be the lead for a plan if we decide to attack Iraq. As we went through this, we were comfortable with either the military governance piece or some sort of civilian, and we didn't call it coalition, I'm sorry, we called it civilian provisional authority, because we saw in the fact that we had a Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who was seen as a diplomat and a soldier, and who we felt would help us bridge the gaps that had plagued interagency planning between the Department of State and the Department of Defense. So we thought, wow, this makes sense. So we were asked after the briefing to the President of Crawford to put together what would be the mission statement and the objectives and a rough concept. And we did that, and General Franks then took that to the President, who had a meeting with his cabinet in Camp David around January 19th, 2002, just prior to his State of the Union address. And in that piece, we were told that the decision had been made that the type of governance structure we would go with would be some sort of civilian provisional authority, and therefore we would be in support. We said, okay, that makes sense. And again, we were comfortable, and we had laid out the objectives that we knew the Secretary of State would understand, having been a former general. We had laid out a rough concept. And we were told then to come back and begin planning, and when we'd be ready to talk with the civilian partners. And we laid out saying it's going to take us a couple months before we're ready to talk to the civilian partners, because we haven't even put a plan together. We have to put a plan together. But having learned from the lessons in Afghanistan, what are the things we need to do that doesn't impede the post-conflict ability to stabilize? And we would work through those things, and I'd like to talk with the State Department about what they thought about those, and make sure that we're on the same page as we start putting together a war plan. We were told, now we don't need to talk to those guys right now. I said, okay, got it. We were confident that Secretary Powell would understand those pieces, and he would have his team working it. So we said it would probably take us 2 to 3 months before we had a plan, when we were ready to sit down and talk with State Department people who also looked at us and said, we don't have a plan. We don't even know what to begin planning on this. We want to start working it. We said, okay, not a problem. We weren't concerned, again, as I said, because if I'm the guy doing the post-conflict plan and I have no idea what the war plan is, I have no idea what assumptions to even base my post-conflict planning on, then I have some real challenges. But I can at least set some conditions for you as to what you can and can't do that would impede my ability to execute a post-conflict plan. Fast forward, we did many briefs. The time for the attack was changed. Originally, they were thinking it was going to be April 27th. We're talking January before the State of the Union address, and we're being told that the execution of the operation might be in April 27th. I think that was the date because that's Saddam's birthday. Don't know where that idea came from. I believe it came out of some folks in Department of Defense. So it was pretty interesting. We were jamming to put a plan together by then. We realized that we just too many obstacles to overcome, and cooler minds prevailed, and we were able to lay out a plan that was a bit more coherent, a bit more time to develop. And we briefed that plan up the chain, and it was briefed to the President on or around 19 June of 2002, at which point what we call is the decision to go to war by the President, I believe, was made then. June briefing. Exactly how, with what forces, and when was not, but the fact that we were going to go, that's when that call was made. So we then got pushed back in terms of developing the plan because you had a bunch of folks, and we had started to see this permeate every aspect of the planning, which was the interference from OSD, Secretary Rumsfeld and his staff, Mr. Wolfowitz, Mr. Fife, who thought they were Clausewitzian scholars, and going to articulate this idea of the revolution of military affairs and therefore the ability to do more with less, and continuous push to downsize the number of troops and the planning and what was required. So a lot of pressure on General Franks to kind of get a coherent plan that the military commanders could believe in and work. And we went through 3 iterations of the plan. So the first plan, as I said, was briefed in June. We did another plan, which we spun in another 30 days, was ready to go by July. And we did a third plan that was less forces, but we had more intelligence on it, that was done in August. At that point, now what we're trying to work is, okay, where are our civilian counterparts? We asked that in June, we asked it in July, and we asked it in August. And what we got instead was a planning order from the Pentagon that said, disregard the original guidance that State Department will be developing the post-conflict plan. You guys have to do that. That notice to do the post-conflict plan came about the same time we were beginning to engage Congress and the UN on the idea of WMD. As planners, when the concept came down and we heard that we were going to base this on WMD, we all looked and went, that's a really bad idea. If anybody knows, I mean, if I were Saddam and attacked me for WMD, I'd do everything in my power to hide the WMD and make sure that you never found any of the WMD. But we weren't even sure they had WMD. So again, probably not the right thing to base the plan on. But we are now putting that together as we're trying to do the post-conflict planning. We ran into some real issues with the post-conflict planning, and we're trying to get it put together. And Secretary Rumsfeld asked General Franks, could we use support from the Standing Joint Task Force, which is a headquarters of about 70 folks down at Joint Forces Command that had practiced as a headquarters that could be pulled, or as a group of folks who could be pulled out, operate as a headquarters and do planning for a conflict, and then they could be augmented by additional personnel as the mission grew. And Franks came to us and asked us, and as a group of planners who at that point, we are now in November of 2002, we've been going nonstop since September of 11. We've probably had 3 days off in that year. Tired, yeah, that's probably a very good word for us, okay? So we're like, yeah, we'll take all the help we could get. At that point, a decision was made by Admiral De-Baathification that he couldn't send his Standing Joint Task Force that might be needed for a real situation, so they were going to execute this idea of an SOP and bring together 70 or 80 folks from across the U.S. Joint Forces and bring them in, and they would stand up an ad hoc headquarters. And thus began, from that point on, what I call our ad hoc approach to everything we did from that point forward. Joint Task Force 4 failed miserably. You had 70 folks, all extremely capable and competent folks, but they had never worked as a headquarters and never worked at this level of an issue. And it's an amazing, when you're working at this level, when you're working with the coalition, when you're working with the U.S. government across the board with all the different players, when you're working with the coalition partners and their interagency, it's a pretty expansive process, and it's not something you just walk into cold and start up. So that process failed. But we did stand up a thing called the Humanitarian Planning Team, unbeknownst to OSD, because one of the guys in the shop had worked with somebody on the NSC, and we could see that there was potential for a huge humanitarian disaster. So we wanted to plan that. So what we did is found a way to work with the NSC, USAID, and Department of State, and to get then working through Gene Dewey at PRM, Population, Refugees, and Migration, to go over and coordinate with the UN so that we could have all the UN agencies and capabilities and the nations in the region ready to deal with a potential humanitarian crisis if, in fact, we went to war and if, in fact, chemical weapons were used. Because as much as people say, oh, we don't know, we were not sure they didn't have chemical weapons. That was the message they were sending, and everybody, and when I say everybody, I can tell you that every country we talked to believed, in fact, they did have chemical weapons. So again, you can look back, hindsight being 20/20, but when you're looking forward and you don't have that hindsight, okay, you have to be prepared. So we were getting ready to deal with that, and we put together a process by which we were able to actually engage through state PRM a hypothetical discussion about what might happen and how might we want to deal with this, that resulted in humanitarian supplies being pre-positioned all around the region, in Syria, in Iran, in Turkey, in other places, that could facilitate a humanitarian crisis. It was a pretty big success. So we moved to then a reconstruction planning team, which was meeting on January 20th or 23rd in Tampa. And we had just had the first day of the conference getting together. And I say that date now, Paul, because on that date, then what was issued was Presidential Directive 24, which stood up WARHA. And as soon as that directive came out, which had not been fully staffed with aid, state, or anyone else, mainly staffed through OSD channels from the Pentagon, caught the CENTCOM commander and his staff off guard. We had no idea it was coming. We watched as a group that come together, truly interagency, and the first truly interagency team I had seen other than the small HPT, and having worked both the Afghan plan and the Iraq plan, okay, this is the first time we truly might have had a chance to do an interagency plan, and watch as all the interagency players walked out ticked off because they saw this as a blindside and a power grab by OSD, which I think it was. That being said, we moved to the next step of ad hoc, which was ORHA. ORHA was given a tough mission. I won't go into much of that piece, just to say that it was a tough piece trying to work with ORHA with what their job was, and the confusion, because if you read that PSD 24, if my 8th grade daughter wrote that for a composition class, she would fail, because it's so unclear into who is in charge of what and what anybody's responsibilities are. But that's what they had, and it caused a tremendous amount of angst and inability to coordinate. And I'll move to the fact that we executed a plan that was not fully developed, coordinated, and staffed across the U.S. interagency. We had a big piece of the plan, and we realized that wasn't happening. So it was a military group at CENTCOM working a little bit with ORHA as best we could. We had a plan that could have at least stabilized the environment until we sorted out the policy machinations going on in D.C., and we can get the interagency to work together. That plan had a good chance of succeeding until we got to Baghdad. And once we were in Baghdad, then it's as if we lost our minds. Because if I would write a book about this, I would call it snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. Okay? Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I'll get it right.
John, is this a good point for Paul to pick up?
I'm going to finish one point.
Okay.
So at that point, what we did is in a time period when we should have been saying, okay, where are we in terms of, as a military organization and as a civilian provisional authority, or ORHA, where were we in terms of now pulling things together, consolidating what had happened, assessing where we were, and what policies we should be implementing. Instead, what happened was Jay Garner basically got relieved because of the confusion between Jay Garner's role and the role of Ambassador Khalilzad and Ryan Crocker with what they were trying to do. There was then the issue of McKiernan standing up and saying, General McKiernan getting relieved because he said we could not get rid of those 2 additional divisions that we needed to flow on and to help stabilize the area. General Wallace was sent home. So the key military commanders were sent home. General Franks was packing up his headquarters to take it back to the States. There's no civilian really key leader in there. There's no real military leader, and there's actually no policy directive and guidance coming out. And it took bringing Bremer on in until about June before we had at least some consistency of thought, okay? But you lost from April, May, and into June before we had consistency and clarity in terms of what we were saying to the Iraqi people, to the Iraqi army, to our coalition, and to our population. And it absolutely resulted in utter chaos on the ground. And based on 2 orders that were issued, De-Baathification and the Army, and the dismemberment of the Army, it resulted in insurgency starting up where there had never been an insurgency at the time. So I'll stop there and open up for questions. But just to give you an idea, the key piece is that Hockery doesn't work. We're still doing it. And we still don't have a process in place to effectively ensure that we as a U.S. government can plan and implement a whole of government plan. We haven't learned the lesson in these last 10, 12 years.
Before we go to Q&A, we're going to go back to Paul, and then we'll hit Chris after that, and then we'll open up to Q&A after that. So, Paul, why don't you pick up where you were in 2002 and what happened?
Okay, thank you very much for being here today. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to go over some topics related to the Iraq War and perhaps some lessons that could be learned. But I'm going to start with a couple of quotes, because these were germane, or should have been germane, to what had been going on within the halls of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, or OSD. The first one is, the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that a statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is foreign to its nature. The second one is that the logical outcome of any war is the reestablishment of peace. And on both accounts, the policy making that went into Iraq was flawed. And as John describes in his rendition there of events, he saw it from a planner's perspective. And when I first read the Presidential Decision Directive 24, which established the Office of Post-War Planning, and that was the title of it. We weren't yet called ORHA, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. I was stunned at how centric it was focused on the Department of Defense. And I even said to my boss at the time, who handed it to me, along with the news that I was being seconded to ORHA the next day, did Secretary Powell ever see this? I can't believe he would have agreed to this. And as John described, it was something that got cooked up in the halls of the Department of Defense and then became policy. And there is still a debate today about whether that document was fully vetted within the interagency process. But the failure of that document was that it assumed that the war in Iraq was going to be a conventional war, a state-on-state conflict that would result in an American victory over Iraqi conventional forces, and after that we could simply turn things over to the Iraqis through the process of establishing the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. It was designed to be a small organization. We had 167 people when we flew over in March, and we were only going to be in existence for no more than 6 months, at which time we would then hand our responsibilities over to some other entity yet to be named. We kind of deceived ourselves in that regard, because that conventional war could only remain conventional as long as the Iraqis agreed that it would remain conventional. And in all of my time in Iraq, I never met a single Iraqi general who admitted to having given up fighting us. They did what we had told them to do during the war, which was to go home or stay in the garrison, don't fight us. And they fully expected when we took Baghdad that the army was going to be part of the future of Iraq. And that did not happen. John mentioned the WMD portion of it, and there have been some discussions over the last week about Iraq and its WMD program. In 1991, when I was in Kuwait City after having being part of that effort of liberating Kuwait, we did find Iraqi systems that had traces of chemical weapons on them. In my work as the Chief of National Security Policy for the Army prior to going to NDU, chemical demilitarization was one of the things I oversaw for the United States. There are things that you see, scientifically, when somebody demills a chemical weapon, and we never saw any of that in Iraq. And so my assumption was, yeah, they got it. They got it. And the whole time our forces are advancing on Baghdad, I'm waiting for some kind of news about it. But we looked at the issue through only one side of the glass. We didn't turn it around and see it the other way. Saddam was practicing deception operations concerning what he was doing with the weapons of mass destruction, whatever they might have been. But if you're a soldier, you do deception operations for one of two reasons. You're either trying to hide your strength, which is what the administration assumed, or you're trying to hide your weakness, which is in fact what was going on the ground, because Saddam could not let it be known to Iran that he didn't have chemical weapons, because he saw chemical weapons as the thing that would prevent Iran from attacking Iraq. The lessons to be learned there is that you have got to red team yourself. If you have a plan and you think the assumptions are solid, you need to get a group of people who had nothing to do with making that plan and give it to them and let them pick it apart from a different perspective. Because that's where you'll uncover the flaws in the assumptions. And so I would hope that not only within the Department of Defense, but within the halls of Congress, red teaming becomes something that people ask for. So when it came to planning for post-conflict activities, it was evident to those of us who soon joined ORHA, and ORHA grew by people coming day in, day out to the halls where I used to work in the Pentagon, and we had nothing to work with. You know, it was clear that the Secretary of Defense and his staff really were not putting much effort into the planning for post-war conflict. Literally, we were expected to provide briefings to the President and to the National Security Council, and at the same time, we're still trying to find computers and telephones with which to work with in the halls of the Pentagon. I mean, nothing had been set up for us. It was disjointed. Our efforts to work with the Department of State were rebuffed. Our efforts to work with senior leaders in the Department of Defense fell on deaf ears most of the time. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy was asked many times to provide support for our organization, and while he said he would, we saw nothing. And so when ORHA got itself organized, it was literally the day before we flew away. And during that time, Jay Garner, the director of ORHA, had been briefing the President on 2 or 3 occasions on our plans for post-conflict stabilization in Iraq. At the same time, we were trying to build ministerial advisory teams that would come in and work with the particular ministries of the Iraqi government so that they would remain functioning. We knew that we would have to take the Baathists out, and we said we would take out the top 3 layers of the Baathist members of each ministry. We knew that we were going to have to do something with the Iraqi army, and the President was briefed on our plans of what we were going to do with the Iraqi army, and we certainly were not going to disband the Iraqi army. We worked on how we would take care of the oil infrastructure, on how we would ensure that there wouldn't be a humanitarian crisis, and how good governance could at least start to be established within Iraq. When we got to Baghdad, it didn't turn out that way. We were not well supported logistically or security-wise in Baghdad. I'm sure many of you probably heard many pronouncements from Washington, D.C. about how we would be greeted with roses and kisses and candy. I did that in Kuwait in 1991, and I know how Arab societies react to liberation. I never saw that anywhere in Baghdad. They were polite. They thanked us for getting rid of Saddam. They were asking us, when are you leaving? You know, they were not anticipating for us to stay. As far as the WMD went, I searched high and low and found nothing to indicate that there was a chemical capability. The work that I did with the Iraqi military, with the Iraqi generals and the colonels, I would ask them about where the WMD is, and they would tell me that they had gotten rid of it a long time ago. And they said, and it was never meant for you Americans. It was always meant for the Persians, and they point to the east. I went out to Al-Thawaifa, the nuclear research facility for Iraq, where the infamous remains of the reactor still stood that had been bombed by the Israelis years earlier. I saw nothing to indicate weapons development there. When I walked out of my first mass grave site, after seeing bodies sticking out of the side of this huge trench and families in there trying to recover their lost ones, and bloody clothes and children's toys at the bottom of the trench, as I climbed out of that trench and I looked around and I was thinking, well, what the heck are we here for? You know, we didn't find what we claimed we would find, and are we here then to get rid of a guy who slaughtered his own citizens? And if so, is that now becoming the foreign policy of the United States? And if so, where do we start and where do we stop? Because there are plenty of candidates in the world. You have to have a clear vision of what you're going to achieve, both politically and security-wise, when you decide to go to war. We did not have that clearly in mind. We disbanded the Iraqi army, and we could talk about that during the Q&A. We had trouble trying to bring together a whole-of-government effort of the United States government because some parts of the U.S. government chose to work with the Department of Defense while others chose not to. And that inhibited our work there in Iraq. We had problems working with CENTCOM, between ORHA and CENTCOM, and with the Land Component Command. It was an issue of where does this ad hoc organization that was established by PDD 24 fit into the scheme of things? Who does Jay Garner report to? And that was sorted out, but it was sorted out on the fly. And because of that, we still didn't have our networks established, our processes down, our relationships built. If you're going to plan for the peace building, you have to begin it as soon as somebody says we need to plan for war. You've got to begin it that early. George Marshall had 2.5 years to plan for the occupation, the military governance of both Japan and Germany in World War II. We had 67 days. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over so that the guy who was on the ground with us all in Baghdad, but he had the troops, and he was the guy on the point of the spear of actually going out on a daily basis and working with Iraqis, Chris Holshak and his Civil Affairs Battalion. Chris?
Well, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Bob, for putting this together. The first thing I want to do is to hold nothing against these two characters to my left for handing me the sow's ear out of which I was supposed to try to make a leather purse. So I don't blame you guys. You were in all this too. We were just trying to do the best we could with what we had. Do we have any Vietnam veterans here? And to you folks and to those who are on the webcast, and I do this every time, the first thing I want to do is to thank you all for your service to our country, because your cause and your service was no greater or no less noble than the one that I was involved in. However, I was lucky enough to come home to a grateful nation. So thank you for your service, and I think it's well overdue. Speaking of which, and there's a couple of connections I'd like to make to Vietnam. The first is we lost. We lost the war in Iraq. And we lost the war in Iraq because we failed to win the peace. And the The other thing that, and I'm going to pick up on some other surprises, like John talking about the fact that were plans, even though people would say there weren't any plans and all this other stuff, is not only the politicians screwed this up. I have plenty of examples to show how the military, the Army, that I love and was 30 years with, screwed it up as well. And that's not all that dissimilar from what we saw in Vietnam either, because that was a myth coming out of the Vietnam Wars. If the politicians had only let us do it the way we wanted to do it, we would have. That's not true. Getting on to the issue of failing to win the peace, I commanded, as is in the short bio there, the 1st Civil Affairs Battalion to deploy in support of the operation. That was the 402nd Civil Affairs Battalion. That was part of the original Civil Affairs Task Force. Of 141 very fine young men and women, 28 women, by the way. So all this business about women being in combat and, hey, been there, done that, got the T-shirts. Very fine young people from mostly from Buffalo, New York, because that's where the unit was from. And as far as I'm concerned, I was sitting. I wasn't in Washington at least all the time. I was coming back and forth on my consulting work while I was getting the battalion ready to go. I had to quit my service in the UN to come take command of the battalion. And a week before I took command of the battalion, I was sitting in front of the TV set watching George Bush give the Axis of Evil speech, and when he stared into the camera and said, "We will deal with Saddam Hussein," I said an expletive out loud and said, "We're going to war." And that was my message. That was my very short change of command speech to my battalion. Folks, we're going to war. Get ready. The problem was I didn't know which war we were going to get involved in. And even on the 22nd of August, when I gave my command information briefing to the component commander that we were supporting, I had one issue on my issue slide, and it was mission clarity. Please, sir, tell me, is it Iraq? Is it Afghanistan? Can I at least give my people some kind of training on cultural country studies for the right country? Well, we didn't get that. We didn't get that until we got the mobilization order until about a week prior to Thanksgiving that year, 2002. When we got to and I had the privilege of commanding this unit through, all of the cycles, if you will, as a reserve commander of, pre-deployment, mobilization, pre-deployment, mobilization, deployment, operations, and then redeployment a year later. The battalion was really not structured for success, and I wasn't certainly thinking about what folks were doing in Washington about that, although a lot of that had to do with it. As I said, I couldn't even get, which country we were supposed to be getting ready to train for. And I had one of the very last deployable civil affairs battalions left in the command because a lot of them had been chewed up in other organizations, and that's a long story. But we basically killed the civil affairs capability with the first rotation of about 1,500 that we sent out there, of about 2,500 deployable people, because we weren't smart enough to think of the long war or the longer term consequences. We were going to blow this all on, this one. It's kind of like going to Vegas, right? You just blow it all in the first shot. But when I went to Fort Bragg with my people, and I went in and said, okay, now I need to get the country cultural briefing from my good buddies over in SOCOM to help us out, and couldn't. It's like pulling teeth. Didn't get any of that. Went forward, and as was said in late January, and we then had the Sitzkrieg before the Blitzkrieg. John talks about ad hocery, I'll talk about make-uppery. And this was trying to do my damnedest to train my battalion ad hoc, not getting, okay, what are we training for, what missions do we have, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually I got the mission. I was actually the person who got the mission that John was talking about in terms of humanitarian assistance. And my general came up to me, the late Jack Kern, and came up to me and said, Chris, you're Mr. Humanitarian Ops. You're going to take that mission and you're going to go forward with it because you know something about the UN. and you know something about humanitarian assistance. And I said, right, sir. And I went forward to coordinate, which would be the logical thing that a civil affairs officer would do, to coordinate with the UN agencies involved, UNICEF, UNHCR, all those folks and the NGOs involved. I was ordered by, and I won't say who it was, but it was a very high officer. None of you guys, don't worry, you can breathe easy. But I was ordered by the chief of operations of CFLIC not to coordinate with the UN. When I asked him out of pure disbelief, why am I not? That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to figure out how I'm supposed to support these people, you know, so they can do what they do, so we don't have to commit our resources to doing this. This is classic civil affairs. The answer that I got was, because we don't want to let them know too much of what our intentions are. And I said to him, sir, we got 85,000 freaking people sitting here ready to pull the trigger, and the whole damn world knows we're going to do this. And you don't want me to go talk to the UN because we might give away some secrets about our intentions? Went to the rock drills and watched, you know, the different brigade commanders, you know, give what I like to call their Right 22 dive speeches. Okay, when I get to this town, I'm going to do this, and we're going to do this. And we got through all the phases and went up to phase 3 Bravo. And then when we got to phase 4, we got what I like to call the public service announcement, which is a lot of what you're talking about, Paul. You know, hey, you know, we're going to be greeted as liberators. We're going to be greeted. We're going to turn oil for food back on. We're going to fund the reconstruction through the sale of oil, and ORHA and the State Department are going to take it over, and we're all going to be out of here in about 6 months or so. And I leaned over to General Kern at that moment, and I said, right, sir, and the great pumpkin is going to come up out of the pumpkin patch and deliver toys and candies to all the children. And I said, we are effed. And I knew this months before because I could watch it, see it, and coming like a slow-moving curveball. We were not structured for success the day we went over the berm. And I had some of my kids went over the berm within 2 hours of the opening of hostilities. I went over the second day, right behind Task Force Taro with the Marines. And the one thing I was telling my kids a year before it was going to happen, I said, and most of them were saying, well, this is going to be like Bosnia and so on, because a third of them had gone to Bosnia. And I said, no, it's not going to be like that. It's not going to be, there's not going to be a peace, and then we're going to come in, and then we're going to, you know, and there's not going to be much shooting and all this other. It's not going to be this kind of linear phased operation, you know, that so many of us had thought, you know, when the peace ops of the 1990s, this was this idea of phases. You know, first this, then this, then this. No, a lot of this crap is going to be all happening at once, and you need to be ready for that. And some months later, when they came, you know, some of my lost teams that were out there, I had all my civil affairs teams spread out among southern Iraq. The first 6 months of the war, we provided support to the Brits, to the Marines, and the Army, and it was about the area of New York State, and pretty remarkable what these young people did, with very little comms and very little support, and they did a spectacular job, and the fact that 60 of them got Bronze Stars because of that speaks for itself, speaks for what they did. They're real heroes.
See, Chris, let me jump in at this point and just take us back just slightly.
Yeah.
And we're, as you can tell from what the gentlemen have said, and the name of this program, they were in the crossfires at various positions and levels, and Chris is getting into what happened in April, May, and thereafter. But let me take us back to 2002, because we also talked about the results and the lessons learned.
Right.
And just a question, particularly for John and Paul, just tell me what you thought about the interagency planning and support, and who should have been doing something more? The NSC, DOD, the President, the CENTCOM commander? How did that really work out for you? I mean, were you given the cold shoulder? You said some supported you, some didn't. What did that really mean? I mean, if you went to Treasury over currency, did they say no? Or you went to Justice over some support for rule of law, did they say no? Or we'll give you 3 people? What are some specifics about your interaction with the interagency?
We were As we said, we laid out a plan, and we talked about the idea of military governance or civilian provisional authority. We were told it would be civilian provisional authority, and we then identified a series of questions that we had for whoever was going to be doing the planning, the civilian provisional authority, and that was what passed, we were told, by the Joint Staff over to State Department. That's what we were told it would be passed on. As we were putting the plan together and looking at things, we then identified other issues like the oil infrastructure. So, hey, who's got the lead for securing the oil infrastructure and how we're going to secure the oil infrastructure? What's the plan and initial guidance for de-Baathification? Are you guys going to be in a position to handle that, or are we going to handle that? What is going to be the deal with currency? Are we going to change out the currency? We're going to keep the current currency for how long?
But now you're asking these questions as a CENTCOM planner of who?
We're asking these questions up through the Joint Staff and getting told that they're taking that to the U.S., the rest of the U.S. government through their interagency working groups that were being conducted via the Pentagon and the Joint Staff. Couple of others, but I mean the real ones, which are the Army, the de-Baathification, the currency, the oil for food. What's the status of the oil for food piece? And how is that going to be implemented? Are we going to be in a position to implement? What's the timing? Because one of the things is if you're going to go in and invade, you have oil for food. If it's a 30-day window, 90-day window, 120-day window, you don't want to invade at the end of that 90-day window. You probably want to do the invasion somewhere around the beginning of that window of the oil for food, so you have some more time in order to get things to deal with in terms of the humanitarian crisis. So those were the questions we were asking and thinking about in April, May, June of 2002. Those were questions that we wrote up and sent up to the chain of command, and were told that we would get answers, and those were questions that we never got solid answers on until May of 03 for a majority of them. The oil infrastructure we did is we put together the task force Rio that secured the oil infrastructure. We had nothing on Baathification. We had nothing on currency. We had nothing on the Iraqi Army. On the Iraqi Army, we did start a PSYOPs campaign against them, where we started to attempt to influence them, one, to not use chemical weapons, and as Paul said, to surrender or desert. And we started that in June of 02 pretty extensively through special technical means and other ways to get the message to them. On ministerial advisor teams, something we're looking at. Who's going to be in charge of what ministerial advisor teams? What do we got to do? What structures in the country should we secure right away? If you go into Baghdad and you're going to make a call between X and Y, what's the call and what's the criteria for making the peace? What are the key areas that need to be secured and why? What are the national treasures that need to be secured? What are the documents, areas that hold documents got to be secured? One of the lessons out of Bosnia is that they burned all the titles and deeds. You want to try to figure out who's going to handle the land stuff. Well, if you burn all the titles and deeds, you can't. Now you go back and, my God, you're trying to reestablish that. So extensive thinking was done on these topics, extensive messages sent forward saying we need information on, coordination of, and we did not get the answers.
And a lot of the questions that John was asking, I was asking too, because, and in fact, 2 days prior to us going over the berm, I still could not get the answer from the force JAG. What is our legal status once we cross that border? What gives me the authority to tell a mayor that he's no longer the mayor? Or to tell this guy that he's the mayor? What documents to seize? Right. And we made it up as we figured out what documents to seize, but remembering Bosnia, you made that good point, John. We seized all the property records we could find.
When Franks went forward for the last meeting with his commanders, he had with him an order we had written that he was supposedly going to issue that was about preventing looting. And it also had paperwork involved that basically was a writ that could be issued by a military commander to a public official, which was you renounce any association with the Ba'ath Party and with Saddam, you certify that you have not committed any human rights violations, and you certify that you serve at the pleasure of the military commander until additional civilian authority could be appointed and take over this responsibility, and you could be relieved for any reason whatsoever, and you could be prosecuted under the UCMJ for lying on this writ. All based on what we had done, looked at international law, worked with our lawyers, looked at things like the Potsdam Agreement, things that had gone into our Japan and Germany. It was all set up. That order and that guidance was never issued to anybody, and we to this day don't know why. So when we watched the looting occur in Baghdad, we just sat there with our mouths open going, oh my God. It just total shock, because it's not what we had anticipated. We were told that the orders had been issued, and I found out from every one of my friends as brigade commanders that they had never seen it. It was never given.
Bob, when going back to 2002, when I moved from the Department of Defense and Headquarters Army over to the National Defense University and the Institute for National Security Studies, the first task that I was handed was to put together a conference, a workshop, that would include the interagency, would include the military, would include international organizations, the UN, and academics and other experts on Iraq, to talk about the day after Saddam. And it was a challenging process to get started, because immediately, as soon as OSD heard about this being put together, we got a lot of blowback from very senior officials within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, even though the reason we were putting this conference on was for one of the subordinate offices within OSD and for the J5. The conference brought together about 100 people, and over the course of 2 days, they, through small working groups, gave me information that I provided for a report that I sent to the J5. It was then General Casey, and to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz. And this report spoke about issues related to good governance. It spoke about the economic issues of Iraq, the security issues of Iraq, and humanitarian disaster potentials. When everything was said and done, and we had come back from Iraq and the war was actually winding down, I pulled out that list of recommendations that we had made, this group had collectively made. And just about every one of them, in some form or fashion, had been fulfilled, except for the way the Ba'ath Party was disbanded and the disbanding of the Iraqi military. So there were things that went on in 2002. We did have State Department participation, and moving forward into 2003, things began to get a little out of whack. And after ORHA was established, one of the first offices I visited within the halls of the Department of Defense was a new office, an office called the Office of Special Planning. And this was the office that was working directly for the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Doug Feith, on the war plans. And I had gone to them to ask about post-war governance, how they envisioned that coming about. And it was amazing that this one OSD office refused to cooperate with either the Joint Staff or ORHA to inform us about what they were thinking and what they were advising the senior leaders of OSD to do. When we built the 20-some-odd ministerial advisory teams that John just mentioned a minute ago, we did that through the interagency process. We would have weekly meetings at the NSC to encourage other representatives to send us somebody who knew something about a particular ministry. When we left on the 16th of March of 2003, we had those ministry advisory teams with us except for one ministry. And that one element of our government just didn't want to provide anybody for it until they felt that it was necessary. We didn't have a ministry advisory team for the Ministry of Defense, which was the Department of Defense's responsibility. We did have one for the Ministry of Finance from our Treasury Department, which in my view was the best functioning ministry advisory team that we had. We had one from Commerce. We had one from Agriculture. You pick it, we had it. but the Department of Defense did not provide us a team until well into the operation.
To open it up now to the audience for questions. Joe, if you could provide a microphone and somebody raise their hand if they've got a question, Joe will give you the microphone. And while you're waiting for the microphone, I'm just going to ask one more question, then we'll get right to you. We've talked a lot about de-Baathification, the disbanding of the Army after they'd kind of melted away, and then and a couple of other issues. But I wonder if somebody could just add a little bit more depth to the de-Baathification issue. Just a little background for everybody. You know, who were the Baaths? Why do we have de-Baathification? And what are the first, second, and third levels? And how does that relate back to what we might have done in Japan or Germany in previous wars?
All I'll say is that the guy who was providing the best advice on de-Baathification was the chief of station who had served in Iraq prior to the first war with the invasion of Kuwait. So he knew all the Baathists. He knew the structure. That's what he's paid to do anyway. It's his job. And when he sat down with Bremer and talked to Bremer in the room, and he looked at him and said, you know, if we look at de-Baathification, there's the top two tiers, and Paul said top three, and again, different opinions. But this guy's looking and saying, look, there's the top two tiers, and those are the guys who are the bad guys. Those are the guys who are Saddam's advisors. Everybody else below that, no big deal. They're Baathists because if they weren't Baathists, they weren't going to keep their jobs. So the top two tiers is probably about 2,000 folks. If you go to a third tier and a fourth tier, you're now into 60+ thousand, and you're firing all your civil workers. So he talked through why you should only get rid of the top two, made the case very, very coherently. Bremer sat there and agreed with him, so we thought, and lo and behold, that was overruled, and that's a whole other piece. But it was just the top two tiers that really needed to go, because the rest really were the civil servants, who were the key folks to running the ministries, running the schools, doing the education. Particularly, General Petraeus comes back, and he's famous for having looked at Mr. Slocum and saying about both the Baathification and the Army, that he was going to be solely responsible for causing a lot of Americans to die, because a key piece, as in any disaster in the United States, the first thing we do is get the schools open. Why? Because you get the schools open, get the kids in school, and the parents can go to their job. We turned around, de-Baathification, fired all the folks, not including the teachers, and now you wonder, they had nothing to do. So it's crazy.
John's right. The Baath Party has 7 layers of ranking in it, and what we wanted to do was take down the top 3 layers of the ministries. It doesn't necessarily equate to the top 3 levels of the Baath Party. We wanted to take down the minister, we wanted to take down the deputy minister, and we wanted to take down, remove the directors general. And that was to ensure that we still had room for other Iraqis, the expatriate Iraqis that were coming back with us on the ministry advisory teams, to move in and help keep the ministries doing whatever they were supposed to do. But the arbitrary nature at times of Baath Party membership really skewed things over there. I don't know if you remember back in the late 90s, it was there was this big agreement between Iran and Iraq, and Iran would repatriate somewhere around 250 or 300 POWs, Iraqi POWs, it had been holding since the end of the Iran-Iraq War of 1988. And the Iraqis made a big deal about repatriating these POWs. And when they came back, these were men who, may as well have come back from, the cave time. They didn't know what was going on in their homeland anymore. But each one of them was made a level 2 member of the Baath Party, was given a car, an estate, and a staff. Because it was a big propaganda thing for Saddam. But because those guys were now level 2 folks, they were being swooped up in the de-Baathification of Iraq. Another example of how this got skewed was in Kirkuk. And for those of you who have looked at Iraq for a long time, you know how important Kirkuk is and how complex that environment is in terms of its ethnic and sectarian makeup. The teachers were all members of the Ba'ath Party. And so they were fired. And yet the schools were kept open up there because that, as John said, that's how you get the parents free to go do their jobs. But the teachers that were hired to replace the Arabs who had been members of the Ba'ath Party were Kurds. And to try and tell an Arab parent that your Arab child is now going to go to school and be taught by a Kurdish teacher, you know, that really inflamed tensions in one of the toughest spots in Iraq. It was a lack of cultural sensitivity, a lack of cultural awareness that contributed to the huge impact that these bad decisions had on Iraqi society. And it further inflamed Iraqis. You know, the Americans are here, they're turning our lands and our children over to the Kurds, or they're taking our land for the oil, or whatever. Make up a story. Iraq is the center of the universe when it comes to conspiracy theories. So, yeah, it was just bad decision making.
And you know, just picking up on some things that these guys said from, you know, outside Baghdad. One of the things you got to understand about how the governorates, the provinces of Iraq are pretty much run. In any given governorate, there's anywhere between about 15 and 24 public administrators who pretty much do about 80% of the public administration in that particular governorate. So everything is sort of centralized at that governor level, and that enables Saddam to keep control. That means that the public administration capacity below that is not that great. And most of these guys, and Paul, you can correct me, but I think most of these guys were somewhere in the tier 3 category. They weren't way up there. Maybe one, a couple, or two of them that were you know, part of the apparatchik centralized in Baghdad. But because you know, you couldn't get any decisions made, and it didn't just affect schools. It affected just about every facet of public services that you can think of: water, sanitation. You name it. And so you had a complete collapse of essential public services in Iraq in those immediate months, but no authority, as I related earlier, no authority to figure out how to turn it back on. And I vividly, in fact, you know, you talked about World War II, Bob. I vividly remembered General Patton's experience in Bavaria, and I kind of took his approach. I said, I don't care if this guy's a Ba'athist. They can fire me. They can send me home, twist my dog tags, and tell me that I don't have a birthday anymore. But I'm going to get to the stuff turned back on, because if they can do that, then, you know, that's, I think, meeting a greater strategic purpose. And there were a lot of decisions, you know, that we were at the business end of, if you will. Among them, the firing of the Iraqi army that we had to deal with. In fact, I didn't know that they had fired the Iraqi army. The Iraqis told me. So that's indicative right there.
Sir, we have a question with the microphone.
Yeah. David Eisenberg with SIGER, Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction Office. This is really for all panelists, but since you mentioned in your remarks, John, I'll start off with you. You had said early on that many of the critics talked about a lack of planning, but I think there's another aspect of it. You of course, articulated that there was lots of planning going on, but there were agencies that did good planning that whose products were ignored. I can remember, for example, the State Department's Future of Iraq project, which was completely shut out, I believe, due to the edict issued on high from Secretary Rumsfeld's office. I can also remember that there was a briefing I went to at NDU put on by the Center of Army History back before the war began, and they had looked at insurgencies dating back to the Spanish-American War, and they predicted quite accurately the likelihood of an insurgency and the numbers that would arrive and what would be required to combat it effectively, which was sort of similar to the famous remarks by General Shinseki, for which he was pushed out. And all this stuff was basically ignored. And so to us, it just reinforces the case for a centralized place to do the planning, because Otherwise, you will always have this bureaucratic bickering. So I'd ask all of you, what do you think of the recommendation in our recent final report to create an integrated civilian military office to plan, execute, and be accountable for contingency rebuilding activities during stabilization and reconstruction operations?
I think it's a great recommendation. I don't think it has a chance in hell of being adopted. There's too many bureaucracies in there. They're going to fight it. You're into everybody's rice bowl. What you're asking for is different agencies to sit down and share their authorities and share their monies, and that we haven't seen that. The only thing that's going to happen if you to stand something up like that would take I think, an executive directive that's more coherently written than PDD 24, and forces the folks to really sit down and play in the same sandbox. But right now, unless there's a crisis looming, I don't see that thing having a chance. Do I think it makes sense? Absolutely. Okay, I absolutely think it makes perfect sense.
To which I would add, I only think that you need to have this kind of a government capability for post-conflict reconstruction and so-called stability ops. I think you need that for the entire spectrum. You need that, if we're going forward here, we need to think a lot more about conflict prevention. And how, would we prevent these kinds of things from happening in the first place? So my recommendation on your recommendation is to make sure that mechanism can work and, in fact, enhance our ability to do what Leon Firth calls anticipatory governance in terms of our foreign policy and security cooperation engagements.
I'll add one piece. It goes back to what Paul said, is we need to stop focusing on winning the war and start focusing on winning the peace. And if you start focusing on winning the peace, you don't start planning when you go into conflict. You start planning before you go to conflict. You start planning to prevent a conflict. And in that planning of preventing a conflict, if you fail, because there are other people involved who have a vote, and you have to actually go to conflict, at least you're going in with a rich awareness and understanding what's happening. But no one agency in our government has the capacity to do the planning necessary to prevent, to resolve, or to transform conflict. And we haven't broken that code yet.
Bruce Oswald, gentlemen, thank you very, very much for wonderful presentations. Understanding the challenges that you all faced in the lead up to the conflict, what experiences did you have in relation to coalition partners and working with coalition partners to smooth some of these issues, or did that make it even more complex?
We had a team from the UK that was detailed to ORHA, led by Major General Tim Cross, with several of his staff officers coming with him. He was with us from the beginning to the end of the lifespan of ORHA. He was sent specifically to assess the ability of the United States and the preparedness of the United States to do post-conflict stabilization work. And he felt from the very beginning that there were problems with the way the United States, at least the Department of Defense, was preparing itself for post-conflict responsibilities. And he so advised the Prime Minister and his staff. Subsequently, he was drawn into the investigation that is so famously known in the UK. So I'm not saying anything out of school here. We did have a Spanish general that worked with us in Kuwait before we went into Iraq, and he was working on the humanitarian side of things. But eventually the Spaniards withdrew after the attacks on the trains in Madrid, and so that ended their response. In terms of coalition activities beyond that, I'd have to turn to John because that was one of his big headaches.
Building the coalition, starting from 9/12 forward, it seemed like every day we had another nation walk in and wanted to join the coalition. And what you quickly realized is that the coalition knew that they brought capabilities, some limited, some bigger than others, and you had to quickly assess what it is they wanted to get out of their contribution. But really what they were looking for in the initial meeting was, are you willing to listen to them, can you show them where their interests, in fact, are covered currently by the plan? If they expressed concern with the plan, were you willing to discuss that with them to consider possibly making adjustments? And as long as you demonstrated to the coalition you were willing to listen, that they could be part of the discussion, they could be a constructive part of the discussion, and that their opinions might not always carry the day, but their opinions were just as important as anybody else's. It's an amazing thing. They felt like they were welcome and part of the coalition. When you violated that is when you got in trouble. And again, other coalitions, based on the number of nations that joined the coalition, you did have some run-ins in which you had specific coalition partners that you had more detailed agreements with. 4 eyes, 5 eyes, they call it 6 eyes in sharing of information. That becomes an interest, and it causes consternation between different nations. But there are other nations who are very mature and understood it. It was really more a case of staff officers not understanding the special relationship that different nations had, and therefore being upset because it seemed like we were talking more with the British than we were maybe with them. They were talking with the Australians and the British at the same level, but they weren't considered on the same level. Well, okay, because we don't have the agreements in place that have been laid out there for years, for you to sign or for us to sign, and we hadn't quite moved forward on them. So again, the coalition warfare piece was very, very dynamic. It was very interesting. It was very challenging in terms of matching their desires, their capabilities against our desires and our requirements for the plan. But I think overall it went very well.
And from the tactical level, my direct support detachment provided the Brits their entire civil affairs capability the first 6 months of the war down in the South. And we did the first transition, or the first relief in place and transition of authority over to what we kept calling the multinational forces. But the NATO forces, our other NATO partners, and in many cases, these guys took to the stability ops, winning the peace work, a lot more naturally than a lot of the folks that I was supporting in the Army in particular, not the Marines so much. Marines get small wars, just like the Brits. The Army doesn't get small wars as well. But we had pretty good work by some of those guys. It's some of the usual issues that we have with our allies, not wanting to be quite as engaged and take some of the risks that we were willing to take. But at the same time, and I think the thing that was most important, which was absolutely crucial, was it was a counter to one of the big propaganda pieces of the growing insurgency. Was the Americans are here and this is their little project and they're here to occupy this all by themselves. And when you come with the whole world, you send a completely different message than when you just come by yourself.
I'm going to call on Chip next, but is there a question on this side of the room? Okay, if we could get a microphone over there.
Yeah,
Chip.
I'm going to start this with Paul, and I thought it was going to be a softball, but I think it's going to turn into an unfair question. I'm going to start with you, Paul, because you threw this out first, though all three of you have talked about it, and that is you have to start preparing for the peace when you decide, or even before you make the decision to go to war, which is what, in fact, a group of us tried to tell your former boss, your neighbor, before the war began, and they didn't listen. The question for you, Paul, and here's the softball part, and then I'll get to the unfair part. The softball part is, how do you do that? How do we develop the capacity to prepare N months down the line when you guys are in the panic mode of trying to get the kinetic piece going? And in some ways that's a softball, because that's what all of us are trying to do in the work that we're doing. The unfair part is, I just finished Moises Naim's new book, The End of Power, this morning. And he talks about a world in which power is fragmenting, in which power that used to be concentrated in one or a handful of places is now scattered networky kinds of ways. If John's right that we can't get the SIGIR proposal through the current structure, how do we try to do what you're talking about planning for peace when we decide to go to war, if power is in fact fragmenting inside the U.S. government or any other government that we are dealing with?
Yeah, that was that's an unfair question. No, no, it's a great commentary on the dynamics of the 21st century, where you have power fragmentation occurring, but that becomes the conditions in which everybody has to operate. The idea that there is a superpower that can dictate to the rest of the world what goes on and what doesn't go on is fast becoming the dinosaur of this century. Now, having said that, how do you work towards reestablishing peace following a conflict? There are a variety of different activities that have to be correlated, orchestrated to come into play. Obviously, you have to prepare for the security aspects of the situation, whatever it might be. Securing the borders, the DDR, the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration aspects. You have to provide for local security, the police, etc. But you also have to start working with others, because the region itself is as important as anything to the security or the stabilization, the peace building, if you will, in the country in question. In the case of Iraq, we were working with Saudi Arabia, obviously with Kuwait, obviously with Jordan. Didn't do such a good job with Turkey, Didn't do such a good job with Syria. Didn't do such a good job with Iran, And that's one thing about the Middle East Americans don't understand, is that you can't say we're going to do this in Iraq and just do it in a vacuum regardless of what the neighboring states might have to say. The famous issue was that of Kurdistan, the autonomous region of northern Iraq, that the Kurds would break away and let's just let that happen. Let's fragment Iraq into 3 entities. People who advocated for that clearly did not understand history and did not understand the dynamics at play throughout the Middle East. So if you're going to be doing peace building, you have to loop in the regional partners. You have to be working with all of the relevant agencies and elements within the country in question. You have to be working with international organizations. But the point that I think we're going to agree on, Chip, is that you cannot do it alone. And that's the important lesson that the United States needs to understand. And again, I don't intend to throw stones at anybody, but we're right now focusing on the executive branch. And I want to say that the legislative branch has as much an interest in this as anybody should, because they're the ones that ultimately are supposed to represent the American people and decide whether we go to war or not.
I would say that it's going to take a tremendous amount of education and training, and I say education first to shape the space between our ears, and then training to teach us how to implement. What I think I can hope for out of the last 10 years is that we can affect the education that our future diplomats, our future developmental folks are getting, and our future military folks are getting. The key to winning the peace is governance. It's not security, it's not economics, it's governance, because security and economics are determined through governance. And people will pick up the guns and feel like and fight for when they feel threatened. And they feel either threatened, in fact, that they're being disenfranchised, they're being isolated from the ability to provide for their family and secure their family. But it's really through the governance structure that you have to build the trust. And we as a government and as a nation don't understand, have not studied our own history to see how long it takes to build the governance. And it takes a long, long time. I mean, in 1968 is when we had the Civil Rights Act, and we said that there would be no discrimination against people of color, but it took us 1968 to get the Civil Rights Act, and we're still not 100% there yet. So it really is a challenge, is how do we focus on training folks to understand how long it takes to build governance, and then what are the steps for that participatory governance to grow. If you think you're going to democracy with a population that hasn't experienced democracy, then what you have is a population that is going to see this as a zero-sum game versus a population that sees it as, okay, I might have lost this round, but I have the next round, I don't have to pick up a gun. And that takes time. And I don't know that we've studied the histories of places like post-Allende, Chile in '72. How long did it take to get to where it's at now? Post-South Korea, where we have an armistice and we worked and as it grew to a democratic country. But how long did that take? And how long did it really take for us to grow as a democracy? What does it take to put in place the education and training of entire generations to change their habits? And then what can we do to continue to work through that, understanding that it's not going to go exactly on a perfect line. It's going to be ups and downs on it. So we had a lot of work to do in our educational realm to teach and educate our people about what it takes to do post-conflict transformation.
John, should the United States have recognized a government in exile for Iraq and used that as the basis for building a government?
Knowing the folks, again, from different agencies sat down and talked about that, because of the arrogance and ignorance within OSD of certain individuals and the sway that one individual, Chalby, had, I don't think we could have pulled it off. You could not have represented the views of the Iraqis through just the exiles. You had to have a way to tap into both the exiles and the people on the ground. I think the first interim governance meeting that we had in the city of in Nasiriyah was a great first step, but immediately we got into the discussion and the conflict and the pull between is Khalazad Crocker the team or is Orha the team because of lack of clarity, and that further fragmented their look at us saying, okay, you guys don't have your act together. So I don't think we could have put a team together, and I think that's actually one of the reasons why Garner actually got in trouble, is that he took advice from Fife and Wolfowitz to try to put a team of exiles together, which resulted in Colin Powell and the head of the agency going to President Bush saying we can't do this, and that's probably the thing that nailed the coffin for Garner. So no, I don't think we could have done it. Could we have worked with exiles to advise us on this? Absolutely. Did we? The wrong one.
Yeah, and we had, in fact, on the ground, we had about 20, 30 Iraqi volunteers who were working with us as interpreters and the like, and who had a fair degree of experience in the country, and they were most helpful. But, come back to what you're saying, Chip, that we're involved in this project, as you know, with USIP and others on this whole issue about ending wars and transforming conflict and preventing it, perhaps, in the first place. What a blinding flash of the obvious. And the more this conversation goes on, it comes back to perhaps maybe what we're trying to do is push a wet noodle here with the whole of government thing. Maybe that's not where the answer is. And I saw, evidence of this in Iraq. Where we had people who just, in the ad hocery and make-uppery, the seeds of people just kind of working outside the governance piece and yet helping the governance piece, but from the whole of society perspective rather than just trying to work within a program or a structure. And for our own sake, maybe that's part of what we need to do. We need to look out maybe outside and quit trying to figure out how to try to just solve the whole government piece with the government dysfunction that we have before we can get to the whole of society piece. Civil affairs people very intrinsically think, they do what I guess a former president was accused of saying, strategery. We need to do more strategery. We need to do this like Wayne Gretzky plays hockey. We need to skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is. And that's, as John was alluding to, is a mindset. That's not a program. That's not a capability. It's education indeed. But it's going to take a community of interest, if you will, of the people who are sitting here to just kind of begin to change the mindset about reaching out to constituencies and communities that they would not normally otherwise reach out to think further ahead, to look at the big picture in the long term and see how that might fit and what you're doing might fit in that. And then maybe we'll create that tipping point for where we can fix the government part.
We've got about 15 minutes left for some Q&A before I'd like to give the panel the time for some closing comments. I'd like to get to as many questions as possible and direct answers as we could. I know we've got the microphone over here. Okay.
Okay. Cool. Doug Brooks, independent consultant. You've all talked about the mistake of de-Baathification and disbanding the army. The converse would be General Patton in World War II, who kept the Nazis in place. The Shias, of course, felt very oppressed by the government. What would their reaction have been had we done the opposite or whatever? Or how do you find the right balance in the future of disbanding an oppressive army or an oppressive government, but keeping the major aspects in place?
The Shias knew that was the upper levels. The Shias also knew that there were a lot of folks in the Ba'ath Party that weren't bad, and lower levels, so they were aware. And they also did not trust us as a force, because we did tell them to rise up the first Iraq war, and they were slaughtered in the streets. So to think that this group that trusted us once lost so many, the mass graves you talk about were a result of them rising up at our encouragement. They didn't believe us. They didn't trust us. They had a very much a wait-and-see attitude. And when they saw the manner in which we dealt with the Baathists, and then the manner in which we lied to the army, they felt they really couldn't trust us. And we lied to the army because we told them in June of '02, from that point all the way forward, that we would bring them back in. And we called the army a group of Baathists. It's the one organization that wasn't. It was the one national entity in Iraq that Shia and Sunni saw. And we just dissed them and told them they were all Baathists and cowards and too cowardly to stand and fight us. We just absolutely ticked everybody off. So again, they trusted us a little bit, and they lost trust with those two decisions.
Doug, I would just add to what John said, that your comment is one that I've been asked many times. It's indicative of Americans trying to pigeonhole people into certain categories. We love to do that. Which team are you on? Who's your favorite baseball player? What's your favorite political party? Iraq is an extremely complex society. For us to try and break it down on a sectarian basis or on an ethnic basis only begs more trouble for us. And we need to be very, very careful about that. And that's why folks need to understand the cultures of where we're going to do. Now, the Army has undertaken a new effort to provide cultural awareness training to the regionally aligned brigades that they're beginning to provide to our combatant commanders around the world. And part of that includes cultural awareness training.
As somebody who was on the ground, I think that what would have helped me more than anything else, the military works on what we call commander's intent, which is right after the mission statement. And if you know what the mission is and you know what the commander's intent, you can pretty much go with a lot of that. Most military professionals don't need somebody to tell them exactly what to do. You just need that commander's intent. And as John and Paul very, very well pointed out, that commander's intent was not clearly articulated. If I had that, and that's the best way to go, a lot of those decisions are made actually better by the guys closer to the ground who learn quickly the intimacies and nuances of all the politics going on at that level, and can figure out, well, okay, this guy's a Baathist, but he's widely seen as the community as a fair and impartial person and can be a unifier. Because if the commander's intent for me is to create more unitary local governance, alluding to what John was saying, then that's cool, then I can do that. But I didn't know what to do. Well, I did know what to do. I mean, because I was a relatively experienced civil affairs officer, but that's what I drew on. I didn't draw on any sort of political or commander's intent type guidance.
Hey, thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and ROA for doing this. Mike Puzon. Last part of 2011, 2012, I was chief of staff of Middle East Transitions, where I dealt with Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, and Yemen. And from your first part of your statement and into your end, you've actually defined that we're not very well or very good or adept to peace building. So I don't know where we are now when we look at these countries I just named off, but I spent an awful lot of time trying to work on economic support for these countries. And it's mentioned in these lessons learned, because you've already covered a wide spectrum, so I want to focus on that if I can. We spent a lot of time trying to say, how can we stabilize the country economically? And back to, John, what you said, governance may be first, but if you take it down to individual, they want a job and they want to provide for their family. In this economic support money that we had in Iraq, did it make a difference at all at any time, or did we not put it in the right place? And I ask that because I know what's happening right now at state and DOD. We're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to put a lot of money in the economic side of the picture for Syria, Libya, Egypt. Okay, so that's my question. Did it make a difference?
I would say that it depends on what pot of money, depends on what time, it depends on what region. So from a coherency point of view, the economic plan tied to the security plan, tied to the governance plan, no, we very rarely got that right in Iraq. We haven't gotten it right in Afghanistan. We've burned, I think, SIGAR. I will have to agree with them, and when they look at it and say that most of the money we spent in both Iraq and Afghanistan went for naught, was not well spent. There are particular ministries where we can see more of an impact than others. Ministry of Health in Afghanistan is one that really, in Iraq, that really seemed to make some progress. Ministry of Education made some progress, but is it helpful? Yes, it can be helpful. At times it was helpful, but just as many times it was not helpful because it flooded the market with money, not well thought out, and not working through the local initiatives as to how to put this money to play in a way that got at why are you picking up your guns and resorting to violence? What are the root causes of instability? Building a hospital may not have been the need, building the education piece, building a well, but we felt good because we thought we were doing something. But what was the real root cause of instability? So again, money put against identifying what the root causes of instability are, what's causing the violence, would be much better spent. And there has to be a mix between a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. And we tend to either go for one or the other, and we don't have the capacity, the understanding how to plan to work both.
Just to give you a real graphic example of what John's talking about is one of my officers told me, we'd spent 2.5 months trying to get 170-ton heavy equipment transport to move a distribution transformer from one end of Nasiriyah to the other end of Nasiriyah, which would have doubled the output of electricity in southern Iraq. Okay, we finally, by the way, got it because we contracted Iranians to do it. That's another story. But he just shook his head and he said, sir, the problem with us, meaning U.S., Big Uncle Sam, U.S. government, we're just so damn big and bureaucratic we can't even get out of our own way. And when I watch my coalition partners, going back to that, they're smaller, and this is one of the great advantages of having these coalition partners. They're smaller, they're not as big and bureaucratic and full of all these rules, and they just can make things happen. And that's a great advantage.
Got a question in the back, then one in the front.
Yes. My name is Eden Naby, and I'm a specialist on minorities in the Middle East and Central Asia. My question has to do with the registry, the deeds that you refer to. Two of you referred to them, and securing the deeds because of the example of Bosnia. So I wonder whether this was also done in the north, in the Kurdish area, where the oil issue now is causing a lot of anguish for Christian minorities, the Assyrians who aren't able to secure their lands because the deeds seem to have not. And I think the same issue is going to occur in eastern Syria, in Hasakeh and Qamishli in particular. And I wonder whether you could address that issue.
Yeah, in fact, my institute's very much involved in that particular region on issues related to the ability of the Christian minority population of the Nineveh Plain to work with the Kurds and the Yazidis and such. The issue of deeds in Iraq is a critical one, and you can look at the city of Kirkuk to see how damaging it is. Saddam arbitrarily transferred entire villages around Iraq so that he could dilute Kurdish presence in Kirkuk. He moved Shia Arabs into Kirkuk to do that, gave them the deeds to the land. They then, in turn, over the course of history, sold and the deed transferred. The original deed has long been lost. And there is no simple solution to it in Iraq. The Kurds north of the Green Line certainly know what property they have. They would certainly like to have some more of the land in the Nineveh Plain because of its agricultural capability or potential. But the issue of deeds is not unique just to Iraq. As John said earlier, it also was a major issue in Bosnia. It's a major issue in every post-conflict society where an oppressive regime has been removed. And you try to sort it out. Really, it's going to take a very long time, especially in Iraq, for them to do it. They're trying to set up a legal system through which this can be done, but that entails, you know, a lot of other moving parts. I just don't think that that's anytime soon.
I think it's an issue that if you deal with it early on, it becomes less of an issue. And early on, that issue was an issue we knew was going to come up. We had asked that question as well. General Odinero, with his unit, had that area in northern Iraq, and he took the time to sit down with the local leaders from the Turkmen, the Arabs, the Kurds, I think the Coptic Christians, and sat down and spoke with them and said, look, how do we solve this problem? And they looked at him and said, it's unsolvable. It's just, it's so many generations. So that if you could work with the Iraqi government, the interim Iraqi government, or with the Coalition Provisional Authority, we are willing, certain groups, we can go talk to our people, and if you were to pay them money, they will drop the claims. And we could work out ways in which, you know, again, paying money based on different circumstances would work with you, and they would, most folks would take money, some wouldn't, some are going to have to go to court. We have that, but we think we can get 75 to 80% of the cases dropped if you're willing to pay money to the folks to recognize they had a claim. And when the general and his staff brought that to Ambassador Bremer, they dismissed it as not the way to go. That's not the way we're going to do this. It has to be done another way, and nothing was done. We lost a golden opportunity, I believe.
Anyway, John and Chris and I have spent long hours talking about how the humanitarian sector can, you know, have better lines of communication with the military, and a lot of this coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly because our civilian government and our military were not necessarily on the same page. And I think even in a non-conflict situation, as we saw, for example, in post-earthquake Haiti, we still had issues where different parts of the U.S. government didn't understand what their different roles were, which made it difficult for us in the NGO and the UN world to interact with the U.S. government as an entity with a common message. And so I was wondering, in the interest of turning lessons identified into lessons learned, would you guys have any top-line bits of advice for your colleagues within the U.S. government now who are at various stages of planning for Syria response, and how they might better interact with the rest of the community that might be engaged in that?
It's one whole meeting. I mean, we went to Gene Dewey, PRM, and let State Department do its job. Gene did his job. We didn't try to do it for him. And Gene went and interacted with the UN and with the humanitarian organizations and talked about a hypothetical situation without disclosing any sort of war plans. We were at risk of, OSD when OSD found out. But you can sit down and have discussions with the humanitarian community, sit down and identify, hey, how to work through this. There are established procedures for dealing with humanitarian crises. We know them in a peacetime environment. They don't change in a wartime environment, so why would we try to change them? The challenge, though, really becomes when the humanitarian community moves into development. And that's where the challenge becomes, because now you transition from that point of providing humanitarian assistance to population in need to now providing aid in which there are strings attached. And as much as many humanitarians like to think all the aid they provide doesn't have strings, we all know that when they're doing developmental aid, it does have strings, because it has, in accordance with the guidelines by the UN of no gender and ethnic or religious what do you call it, discrimination, there are strings attached. And that is where the issue really becomes a challenging piece. However, again, there are the cluster system that the UN's come up with, and that cluster system that the UN has come up with identifies units or organizations that have specific capabilities, can work in those areas. So it would do us very well as a U.S. government to sit down with the international community and discuss how do we apply the cluster system, how do we get these folks on, helping to do what they do best, and how can we enhance their capabilities, but also discussing in other certain circumstances, how do we transition this so that you're not at risk, and get past this discussion of, if I touch with the military, I'm going to get killed because you're all bad, and us thinking that, oh, don't worry about it, we can go talk to you and it's not going to cause you issues. It does. We set up a thing called the Humanitarian Coordination Center in Kuwait. We kind of called it Over the Horizon. It was a place in which humanitarian organizations sit down and coordinate with the military, get updates on what's going on, and when they went forward, no one ever saw the military interacting with them, but we were sharing information back through commo chains that was invisible to the population, so there's no perception of us working together. So there are things we can do that we can learn from in this upcoming series of events that we think is going to happen in Syria and other places.
I guess I have it here. I was interested, I hadn't heard that story about the COS Brief and Brenner on who not to debath, or how deep into the Ba'ath Party they're going to go. I did spend some time over there in May, June '04 with the OGA, so familiar with that. But my question is, who made this decision? Was it Bremer or was it above him? Who actually made a decision to, because I remember taking the Civil Affairs Advanced course back in the mid-'80s, and that was one of the things, you only go down as deep as you have to and use some common sense. And so I guess, where was that decision made?
It was, I can't say specifically. I know Bremer was very hard over making the decision, and part of the influence was Chalby, the influence that Chalby had on Wolfowitz and Fife. I can tell a short story is that a Special Forces soldier was assigned as a LNO to Chalby and the forces, the Free Iraqi forces that were brought on in, really a bunch of criminals. When that soldier had a family incident, he had a death in his family, he had to leave suddenly. I was asked to secure a Stu 3 phone, which is a secure phone that Chalby had, because he had that. Where was that Stu 3 phone connected? Well, it wasn't hooked into Bremer. It wasn't hooked into McKiernan. It wasn't hooked into Franks or Abizaid. It wasn't hooked into anybody in Iraq. So the influence that Chalby had was this belief by a group of folks, Rumsfeld and others, who thought that Chalby had all the answers and was their friend, when in fact the chief of station at the time was the guy who had developed him as an asset and had dropped him as an asset after the first Iraq war, because he realized he was a corrupt criminal. And against his advising, I watched some of your organizations sent home when they advised not to work with Chalby. So Chalby had a direct influence. Bremer made that decision, but that decision was supported clearly by Wolfowitz, Fife, and Rumsfeld.
Great. My name is Nathaniel Rabkin, and I work for a magazine called Inside Iraqi Politics. I wanted to ask you guys, going back to the planning process in 2002, as we all know, that was an election year in the United States, which was pretty hotly contested, and it came in, right after this very close presidential election. Everybody knows 2 years going forward there's going to be another very closely contested presidential election. How did the electoral politics play into your planning process, and how do you think it affected the planning process for the sort of political appointees and cabinet level people above you?
It didn't. Simple answer, it didn't. The way that we plan operations is, we work for civilians, okay? We don't sit around and tally up, electoral college votes or anything like that. I would say that there was a heavy political influence on why the war began, but show me a war that doesn't have a heavy political influence. War is a political instrument, So, but in terms of were we planning this or that, it didn't. Now, having said that, in the summer of 2004, I was asked to meet with Secretary Rumsfeld's special representative to NATO, a fellow who is now deceased. And this fellow, who had been an experienced ambassador for the United States for many, many years and served a long career, wanted to ask me about how to stabilize Anbar, because in 2004 Anbar was going to hell in a handbasket. And he had just come from Amman, where he had just met with 6 sheikhs from Anbar, and each sheikh had his own former division commander with him. So these 12 guys were recommending that if the United States would allow these 6 divisions to reorganize, they would all be Sunni, of course, that they could stabilize and pacify Anbar. And so because of the work I'd done with the Iraqi army, I was being asked to consider it and, you know, give them some ideas, and if I thought it was a good idea. And I said it's a very bad idea, because then you will have created an army that would have no loyalty to Baghdad, where we had just stood up a new Iraqi government. And Ambassador Galbraith asked me then, well, what would you do? And I said, well, you know, if you go back to what our experience was in Vietnam, towards the end of Vietnam, the Marine Corps developed this civic action program, which took small detachments of Marines and put them out into the villages of their area in Vietnam and worked with the local defense force. They lived with them, they trained with them, they ate with them, they slept with them, and they fought and died with them. You know, and that's how we improved security in those areas, because we were there to stay with the people, protect the people. And he asked me, oh, how long would it take for the Marines to get this going? I said, I don't know. You know, it's July. If you get it going now, probably in 6 months they'll have it up and running. And the response I got was, oh, that's too long. We have an election before then. And that's when I kind of tuned out and said, okay, you know, do what you want, but I'm not any part of this conversation anymore.
Where the election impacted was in the early stages of the response in 2001, and where that impacted was, once again, as an ambassador taught me, he said, you know, it's famous in American history the way we do this. You have a new guy come on board. The first crisis he faces, he looks at it and goes, you know, part of the reason why I got elected, he said, I'm not going to do the way the other guy did it. So everything the other guy did was wrong, so everything we're going to do is different, and we're going to relearn all those lessons all by ourselves because we're smarter, better than they are. And then 5 years into it, after people have been back for the second and third time, we realize, oh, damn, maybe that stuff wasn't that bad, and we got to start on over. But in 01, the very clear proclamation that we don't do nation building, that we aren't here, that we could, we're not going to do what was done in Bosnia. In Afghanistan set us up for failure in Iraq, because the approach we took in Afghanistan was we put in charge of a guy who we thought we trusted because he was a nice guy. We had the similar guy in Chalabi as we had in Karzai. We really didn't understand his politics or how he was going to operate. We didn't understand the circumstances on the ground, and we had a thing called the Bonn Agreement, which had no mechanism for enforcement, but briefed well and wasn't getting us to put a heavy footprint in there like we had to do in Bosnia and Kosovo and threaten, and we could use our coalition allies to solve this challenging issue called Afghanistan with really no enforcement mechanism, and a program that the planners at CENTCOM looked at and said, this is going to fail, and in fact it did. So politics played in our initial response, and this idea of the little footprint, which you heard all over the place. Not saying I like a big footprint, but there's a way that you have to address issues, and you can't just address it with a little footprint at the national level.
We have about 12 minutes left, and I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give several of their comments in closing. But included in their comments, if they could, I'd like them to suggest, just in bullet form, again, some of the lessons learned that we just have to take away from those first year before we began the Iraq War and the first 6 months after. What do we have to take away for future generations? Somebody mentioned Syria earlier. What are the 3 or 4 things that you would recommend to people? And while Chris is thinking about that, I'm just going to ruminate for about 20 seconds and say I thought the first question was very interesting. The gentleman from SIGIR and Learning from Iraq report, where they had suggested a civil military planning office. And I know in my own experience, well, I've got the greatest admiration for the American military and the active component. I just wonder, where in the blazes does the expertise, although they've got a million expertises, come for post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction? Where is the MOS that gives them that? Potentially you've got it in the reserve component, but where does it come from? Where does it come from in the State Department? Wonderful diplomats, but where do they learn how to run a village or run an electrical company or pave a road or build a school? I don't think any of the diplomats learn that. And our wonderful senior executives at the various departments of government are extraordinarily talented in running in an American system, which they've learned 99% of their lives, most of them, how to run the agri department or the currency or whatever. Maybe Treasury is the exception, because I know they have done a great job in numerous international situations. But most of our experience is so limited to the United States that I just wonder where we bring the talent from. And I conclude ultimately that that talent has to come more and more from the private sector, the academic sector, the NGO sector, but not from the military, not necessarily from state. But that's my editorial comment. Chris, would you have some thoughts we should take away from it?
Well, Bob, you stole a little bit of my thunder, but you know you're right on there. Well, first thing I want to do is there's a quote I'm going to give you from none other than George Friedman from a piece he wrote in Stratfor only 2 days ago, which I think is the seminal lesson of not maybe this last 10 years, but maybe even the last 20 years. The greatest military power in the world has the ability to feed armies, but it is a far more difficult thing to reshape societies in America's image. And with that, I'll give you a few bullets, and this is really kind of like the things that I've learned in 30 years of doing civil affairs and that kind of stuff. The first thing is if we haven't done this by now, and as somebody, I tell you, somebody who's served in the United Nations in both civil and military capacities, I tell people who start to diss the United Nations, I thought we were going to show the whole world how to take down a regime and put it back together on the cheap. How'd that work out? All by ourselves. And the UN has to do this with no budget, not a real great planning capability, and usually, a whole bunch of people to coordinate with. 193 different members of the General Assembly, so start with that. I think we need, the first lesson is in humility. I think that we just need to be a little more humble about this sort of stuff. And that then turns to managing expectations. And whenever I teach civil affairs people, I tell them you need to manage expectations first and foremost. That's your first order of business. You need to manage yours. You need to manage those of the people you report to. You need to manage those of the people that you're working with, and most of all, those who you are trying to help. Because we, as John was saying, we had these people thinking that they were all going to be driving Cadillacs with a 7-Eleven in 6 months. And when we couldn't deliver on that, well, guess what? We all saw that. And, if you want to measure effectiveness, just look at history. This business about winning the peace is really applied strategy. And applied strategy is thinking globally and acting locally. Thinking strategically, acting tactically, playing like Gretzky. Gretzky was no more capable or talented than any other player in the National Hockey League. He just understood the game better. And that alludes to your quote, Paul, from Clausewitz about situational awareness and situational understanding. And anybody knows in combat, that's the real reason why people get killed more times than not. And that's the real reason why you don't win the peace either. And going last but not least, if we're going to be involved in this kind of work, and if we're going to engage the world, and we're going to try to get in the sandbox and play nice with the other people, whether it's conflict prevention or whatever it is, we need to read a little more history. Okay, that's it for me.
There are a lot of lessons to be learned from Iraq, from the time when the planning began to the final withdrawal of American forces. There are still lessons to be learned from Iraq because the United States remains engaged in some degree. I want to go back, though, to the Sigger comment. Organizations are designed for specific purposes. And when you are looking at an entity like the United States, tying in with what Chris just said about humility, we have to recognize we cannot be all things to all people. Okay? There are going to be times when an organization can be stood up, but it's still not going to get done what needs to be done. It's the people in the organization, and whether they have been trained and educated and have the requisite experience to do the things that the expectations of the organization require. Second thing that I would take from the planning of Iraq is a need to better understand the process of DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. At some point in time, the United States will be involved with that again. You cannot wait until the day the force surrenders or whatever to think about, oh God, what do we do now? I mean, that's what we were doing in Iraq, and it became a pickup game, and it resulted in a disaster because part of that DDR process, well, the entire DDR process was stopped cold by a miscalculation by political leaders. And then the third thing that I would say is begin preparing to plan for peace now. You know, if we think we're going to have a role in Syria, and we do, we need to be thinking about that now. And there are people who are thinking ahead that have actually begun this process. The Day After project with the Syrian National Council is a great example, but it needs to be resourced to make it happen. And finally, you know, judging the worthiness of any war is a fool's errand at times. It can be a waste of time. You can't look at a particular period in time and say that was a good war or a bad war. Depending upon your perspective, I tell you, the three of us thought that was a bad war, not only because of what was going into it, but, you know, if you're the individual troop on the ground and somebody's shooting at you or lobbing mortars at you, that tends to make you feel uncomfortable. But you got to look at the long-term trend that's going on right now in the Middle East. And this war is just a part of that trend line. Is that trend line going up or is it going down? And certainly, in my humble opinion, in the Middle East today, the strategic advantage belongs to Iran. And we have to deal with that. Thank you.
What I would say is the political process is supreme, and if you're going to deal with a conflict, post-conflict, or conflict transformation, it's graded by how well you do in the political process, because the political process is the means by which you buy in, or you get buy-in from all the participants. And while they have short-term economic and security needs, if you cannot give them a viable political solution that will allow them to feel secure in those security and economic needs, then you don't have progress. And what you wind up doing is lapsing back into conflict, as we see in many places where we fail to focus in on the political process. So political process is supreme. War it's politics with violence attached to it. The national perspective and the local perspective. We as a nation tend to take the picture that we're going to work at the national level, and we fail to understand that you need to work at the local level. You need to work both. You need to have that policy piece being driven out of a national center, but then informed by what the people see coming up from the local level, so you can account for the different perspectives and manners in which you do that. In a place called Afghanistan, we chose to throw the monarchists and basically the Taliban out of the peace process instead of keeping them in the peace process. Again, it's a political process, so the monarchists and the Taliban have chosen to voice their political disagreement through other means called arms. And at the local perspective, again, you have to own the night. At the local perspective, you have to understand how can you always provide for the security and protection of the population. If you're not out there living amongst them, you can't protect them. And if there's a power vacuum, someone will fill that power vacuum. And what we've generally seen, that's mafia, criminal, or insurgent that will fill that power vacuum. And if you're not there, you can't fill it. You can't influence it. Interagency MOSs, interagency skill sets. There was a report done, it was either by the Science Board or the 9/11 Commission, I forget which. It was done 10, 15 years ago, so we won't pay attention to it because obviously the guys sitting on it don't know as much as we do. But they recommended interagency planning MOSs as a means to maybe start drawing us together as a U.S. government. And the areas they talked about were in planning, civil affairs, intelligence/information, and public affairs. I particularly think public affairs is a key one because let's think of actions. We often think of actions as actually doing something. Words, I think, how words are delivered is an action. How we deliver a message is an action. We don't understand that. The manner in which we deliver messages and the impact that has. Words matter. We don't ever get that. We need to get so much better at that. Education, two areas that would have a tremendous impact just on our military, and I'll talk there, is education on cultural awareness, not training on cultural awareness. Don't tell me I can't go to Afghanistan or somewhere in the Middle East and eat with my left hand. I'm left-handed. When I go in and I tell the folks that, they laugh at me, go, no, don't worry, go eat with your left hand. We get it. Don't worry, no big deal. Most of them don't mind. People sit there and say, look, I've sat there with sheikhs, I've sat there with folks. They don't care about that. What they care is, do you really understand their culture? Have you the ability to look at their culture and comprehend their culture? Most of us in the Army don't, because we don't understand our culture. And I would dare to say most of you sitting here don't understand your culture. If you understand how your culture evolved, you then can study somebody else's culture and understand how their culture evolved and why there's differences. But what I saw is people either looked at our culture or the Afghan culture or the Iraqi culture and said, oh, these guys are either barbarians or, you know, they idolized it with 3 cups of tea and that sort of stuff, instead of really understanding in depth what their culture was and why how they interact. The other is situational assessment. You got to assess the situation. If you don't spend time assessing, you're going in and you're just acting. And if you're acting without an assessment and understanding, you're doing more damage than good. And finally, train our military to ask when they're told that we're going to go to war, to ask what type of peace first. Because if we understand the type of peace you want to achieve first, then we can sort out what type of war we should fight. And we, again, as an organization, as a government, need to understand that. It's not just a military question, because, again, political process is supreme. What type of peace do we want to get out of this engagement? I realize there are circumstances where you go to war. I'm not naive, been there. But if we don't understand the type of peace we're achieving, we don't understand then how to fight the war effectively to ensure that we're setting the conditions to achieve that peace.
Well, I'll just close by saying it's been a real privilege to be a small part of the program today, and the depth and breadth of your understanding, your eloquence, the passion you bring to it, and your continued your contributions both in the active component for John and Paul and in the reserve component for Chris were astonishing over many, many years, and just as a real tribute to the American military that you folks could evolve from that and now continue. John as a VP with IDS International, of course Paul with a dozen titles over at the United States Institute for Peace, leadership in all of them, and Chris Olszak as a fellow at the Alliance for Peace Building, and engaged in so many programs and efforts to bring about the goals that the gentleman just discussed. You folks have just been terrific, and I just ask the audience to thank you very much.